Hello and welcome to the International News Daily Podcast. I'm your host, Dennis Dunicic. Like, comment, and subscribe. Join our growing international community. Today's report is going to be a follow-up on yesterday's, or more specifically, the Freedom Convoy in Canada, and its last holdout and stronghold in Ottawa. Now, yesterday, we did a general report on what these protests were encompassing and what the truckers, primarily truckers and other sympathizers, were protesting against. Now, you can find yesterday's report in our North America playlist, and I highly recommend that you watch it. It is informative. But we will give a brief overview of what these protests have been. Now, these protests and this movement, it's more accurate to call it a movement at this point, began roughly 3 weeks ago when truckers organized against a vaccine requirement for big rig truckers and transportation workers who are coming from the United States into Canada being required to be vaccinated to enter the country. Now, obviously, this was something that was important to their livelihoods, to be able to work, to be able to function, and to have a paycheck. And they did not feel that it was appropriate for the government to mandate them getting a vaccine. As such, they began to organize what was known as the Freedom Convoy, or a group of truckers protesting in big rigs, blocking off roads, most notably blocking off the Ambassador Ridge between Windsor, Ontario and Detroit, Michigan, and shutting off economic production, particularly in the auto industry, between the United States and Canada. Now, in addition to that major blockade, they have been blocking off many major roads throughout Canada, hurting traffic, hurting economic productivity, and being extremely disruptive. Now, I know that I sound negative or that I'm attacking them, but I'm not. When you do a proper protest and you want to send a message, you have to cause some form of not necessarily pain, but you need to be noticeable and felt. And that's what these truckers were doing for the last 3 weeks. Now, the protests began to significantly dissipate. Most notably, the blockade on Ambassador Bridge ended last weekend with police arresting dozens of protesters. In addition to this, one of the more notable moments of the protest was a blockade on the city of Manitoba in Canada, which also blocked off a border crossing between Manitoba and North Dakota. Now, this part of the protest in Manitoba ended peacefully on Wednesday. The final holdout and the final stronghold of these protests was in Ottawa, which is the capital of Canada and where Parliament Hill is located and the executive branch of the Canadian government, which is extremely important to understand. Now, this protest began as a movement against vaccine requirements. However, it quickly evolved into being a protest against any COVID-19 related mandate or restrictions whatsoever. Now, finally, in its final zenith and form, the protest had turned into a general attack against the mandate of Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Now, again, these protests have been lasting for 3 weeks, and yesterday we covered on how they are still holding out and being persistent, despite the fact that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau on Monday of this week invoked Canada's Emergency Act, which gives the executive branch and law enforcement of Canada extraordinary powers to react to emergency or extraordinary situations. Now, specifically how Justin Trudeau, the executive branch of the Canadian government and law enforcement, has reacted to these protests after the invocation of Canada's Emergencies Act has been to allow law enforcement to tow away the big rig trucks, to arrest protesters by deeming the protest as illegal, and most draconianly and dictatorially and authoritarian, I think is the word that I'm looking for. In the most authoritarian sense, the biggest undemocratic aspect of the invocation of the Canada Emergencies Act has been to block and freeze the bank accounts of these truckers and the sympathizers, the protesters involved in this movement. And also, for the truckers, the big rig transportation workers that are protesting in this movement can have their commercial driver's licenses suspended. And that is a huge issue. Understand that if you are a big rig trucker, you live, feed your family, and get every paycheck based on your ability to drive. That is your breadwinner. And this was extremely draconian. Now, despite all of these methods and threats that were introduced by the executive branch, by Justin Trudeau, and by law enforcement in Canada, the truckers still persisted in their protests in Ottawa. Now, yesterday we were covering and how the Canadian government was in a tricky place and how it's going to react to this protest, and hopefully that it would not react aggressively. However, it seems that our hopes were not fulfilled. Last night, right after I had finished filming and posting the podcast and the episode, the Canadian police took preemptive action by arresting the two major leaders of the Freedom Convoy. Now, they are arrested and in custody, and they are expected to be in court on Friday, facing charges of mischief and obstructing police. In addition to this, today on social media in the morning, police began to post extensive warnings on social media, telling the protesters to leave and that if they didn't, they would be arrested. Now, some protesters did voluntarily leave. Notably, some big rigs in the morning were seen turning on and leaving the parliament and leaving the capital of Ottawa. Despite the warnings, many protesters stayed, most notably dancing in the streets to the Beastie Boys' "You Gotta Fight for Your Right to Party" and Bob Marley's "Get Up, Stand Up for Your Rights," while screaming "Freedom! Freedom! Freedom!" That sounds fun. But they were still protesting despite the threats of police to arrest them, which they did not heed. And police moved in this morning on the protests and the encampments of the truckers and their sympathizers. Notably, last night, before they moved in, the police had blocked down the downtown sector of Ottawa, so other sympathizers could not enter in to give backup to the protesters. And police entered with full force, many police officers carrying assault rifles and wearing tactical gear. Now, the reason for this is many of the protesters have been individuals that have been seen with firearms, and the police wanted to prevent violence, but going in with firearms yourself just increases the likelihood of violence. Now, what these police officers did is they went from truck to truck, from caravan to caravan, from tractor to tractor, telling people that they had to leave, and if they didn't leave, they would be arrested. Now, most of the protesters did surrender or voluntarily leave if they were able to. However, many protesters had to be forcefully arrested, and many have been seen leaving the protests in handcuffs or still holding up signs saying "freedom from mandates." Now, basically, the entire reaction of the Canadian government is exactly what we were not hoping for. This is going to be counterproductive for anyone that wanted to end these protests. The reality is that these people were protesting government oppression, and they wanted to have freedom from what they viewed as a repressive government. Now, the government has reacted with more oppression. And while this means, and while the police have been able to quell and prevent most of the protesters, they have won the battle. But what they have done is created a war. There probably is not going to be a freedom convoy in the coming days, but this taste is going to stay in the mouths of Canadians who have been fighting for freedom, and they will protest again. And this is going to have a major impact on Canada. Now, as I mentioned yesterday in the report, Canada is extremely well known for being or having some of the most civil, law-abiding, rule-following populations on Earth. Canadian people are extremely civil. They're extremely nice, polite, and they truly do not like to break the rules. Really, I was in Toronto recently, and I honestly cannot remember a time where I have met a more genuinely, generically nice people. And sure, I am generalizing, but if you go to Canada yourself, you will see this. Canadians are truly like this. Now, this has been the most disruptive protest in, I think, a Western democracy since the Yellow Vests in France. And it's shocking that this came out of Canada. When the Yellow Vest movement came out of France, it was a shock to no one. The French people are known for their protesting, are known for fighting the government. The Canadians are not known for this. And it was shocking that this came out of Canada. Now, Justin Trudeau and the left wing of Canada have blamed the influence of actors from the United States, particularly US President Donald Trump, tech billionaire Elon Musk, and Fox News and other conservative commentators who have been encouraging the protests and raising money for them. But the reality is even according to Justin Trudeau's largest projection, that 50% of all the financing for the freedom movement is coming from the United States, don't you know? Even if that's true, even if 50% of the financial ability for this movement and these protests did come from people, actors, or other institutions in the United States, the other 50% came from fucking Canada. And that's a government projection. So reality is it's probably 20 to 30%, even less. What actually caused these protests, Trudeau, is people being against your oppressive government and wanting to fight for freedoms. Maybe people eventually took inspiration from the United States culture of standing up to the government, of protesting, and of fighting for your rights. But these Canadians worked on their own, and this is not an American movement. This is a change in the Canadian general social attitude, and it is an exemplifying indicator of how Canadians, Canucks, and other people in the country feel about the government of Justin Trudeau. The battle is over, but the war has just begun. This movement is not dead. This movement will continue, and this movement will grow. But that's what I think. If you disagree with me, let me know in the comments. What do you think is the future of the Freedom Convoy? Now, keep in mind that the Freedom Convoy has actually moved to many other countries, particularly in Europe, France, the Netherlands, and now Greece, with people protesting with tractors against increasing inflation and demanding government subsidies for agriculture. People have decided that blocking off traffic is a really good way to protest. Surprise, surprise. Other movements have been attempted to be organized in the United States, so that has yet to come to fruition, but it may. Again, I believe this is just the beginning and not the end. But if you disagree with me or you agree with me, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like this video and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thank you for tuning in. I'll see you next week.